"You don't belong here, criminal." The cop spat as if stomping out trash, but he picked the wrong target, a former top-tier strategic advisor for a classified federal security program. The moment that kick landed, the courtroom froze not from shock, but from the sheer stupidity on display. He didn't just assault a man, he kicked America in the face, thinking he was the law. Would watch till the end, to see the brutal downfall of a man who thought a badge gave him the right to abuse. The heavy oak doors creaked open with a groan that sliced through the stagnant courtroom air like a blade. Every head turned as the Navy SEAL stepped in, a towering silhouette that seemed to swallow the light behind him. His posture was straight, rigid as a steel beam, each breath slow and deliberate, chest rising with the rhythm of a soldier who had tasted sand, smoke, and blood. His eyes didn't waver, locked onto the white police officer standing smug at the far end, as if he owned the place. The SEAL's boots thudded against the polished floor, echoing through the hall like distant war drums, each step declaring that this wasn't a place of law today, it was a battleground. A shaft of sunlight knifed through the tall windows, slicing across the SEAL's broad shoulder, tracing a line over muscle carved by endless push-ups and silent midnights in enemy territory. It painted him with a raw, violent grace, like a warrior marked by fate itself. Every eye in the courtroom latched onto him, some with fear, some with awe, but he didn't blink, didn't flinch. His presence ate the oxygen, leaving the room gasping in a collective silence that thundered louder than any verdict. At the front, the police officer shifted, his mouth curving into a sneer so thin it might have cut skin. His fingers slid to the butt of his holstered gun, a move so brazen it tore through the unspoken decorum of the courtroom like a bullet through paper. The SEAL's gaze followed the hand, unblinking, absorbing every micro-shiver beneath that uniform skin. The officer's smirk widened, venom leaking from his lips as he tilted his head back just slightly, eyes gleaming with twisted delight. "Guess you don't even deserve to breathe the same air as us humans," he hissed, each word dripping in contempt, slicing through the air like shards of glass. The SEAL didn't answer. He simply tilted his head to one side, vertebrae popping in a slow, deliberate crack that resonated across the benches. It was a sound that didn't belong in a courtroom. It belonged on a killing field at dawn. The movement was so precise, so cold, that a shiver snaked down the spines of everyone watching. For a second, the room forgot to breathe. His jaw flexed once, tight, a silent snarl held on a leash. That single, almost casual gesture communicated more than 1,000 shouted threats. It was the kind of controlled violence that only a man who had wrestled death could carry. A bead of sweat slid down the officer's temple, catching the sharp light and shimmering like a tear he would never shed. The SEAL's chest rose again, deeper this time, as if he was drawing in every lie, every insult ever spat at him. The officer shifted on his feet, his smile faltering just enough for anyone paying attention to see the fracture beneath. In that moment, the air between them thickened, heavy as concrete, each heartbeat echoing like a hammer on a war drum. The SEAL's hands stayed loose at his sides, fingers relaxed, yet they radiated an energy that promised he didn't need a weapon to break a man down to dust. Nobody dared interrupt. The judge remained frozen, the bailiffs glued to the floor, even the reporters forgotten behind their glowing screens. This wasn't a court anymore, it was a silent arena, the SEAL standing as a lone gladiator, the officer a cornered predator sensing his blood. The SEAL's eyes narrowed slightly, pupils sharp, dissecting the officer's soul layer by layer. The sunlight caught on the faint scars etched across his knuckles, each one a testament to battles survived, without witnesses or mercy. In that fleeting glow, his skin shimmered like obsidian, unyielding and cold. The officer licked his lips, his voice cracking around a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What? Cat got your tongue, soldier boy?" But the words fell flat, lifeless, swallowed by the pressure emanating from the SEAL's silent defiance. With no words, the SEAL answered everything, his spine a spear, his breath a war cry pressed into his ribcage. The courtroom felt the shift, a gravity well forming around him, pulling every pair of eyes, every ounce of fear and respect into that singular moment. He didn't move forward, he didn't raise a hand, yet the officer seemed to shrink, folding into himself even as he postured. Time hung suspended. Every sound magnified the slight crack of leather straps, The officer's nervous swallow. The SEAL's heartbeat loud enough to shatter glass if it could be heard aloud. The SEAL inhaled one last deep, controlled breath, the kind that spoke of decades of discipline, pain, and unwavering conviction. His exhale was almost a whisper, yet it roared through the courtroom, a silent anthem for anyone who knew what it meant to stand their ground against the world's scorn. That unbroken gaze, the micro-flares of muscle across his jaw, the slow tension in his forearms, every inch of him screamed, "You cannot break what was forged in fire." In that breathless standoff, the courtroom transformed into a coliseum, the SEAL's silent presence eclipsing any law, any badge, any hollow authority. He didn't need a speech, didn't need to brandish fists or guns. His existence alone was a blade pressed to the officer's throat, daring him to swing first, knowing he would crumble before the first blow even landed. The officer tried to muster another insult, but his tongue stuck to his teeth, the words dying before they could betray more weakness. The SEAL's lips twitched, almost imperceptible, as if he knew exactly how little it would take to make the entire facade implode. Every spectator felt the invisible line drawn in that room, one man's pride against another's entire identity, a duel beyond fists or bullets. The SEAL had already won, and he hadn't even moved. That crack of his neck still echoed somewhere in their bones, a reminder that real strength never has to scream. The officer stood paralyzed, trapped in the vice of his bravado, while the SEAL stood unmoved, the living incarnation of silent thunder. No verdict had been spoken yet, but the room already knew who commanded its soul. The silence that had devoured the room cracked open as the officer stepped forward, his boots scuffing the floor like claws scraping metal. He leaned in, his breath sharp, voice slicing between clenched teeth. "Heard you used to hold a rifle? I dare you to use those fists here." His words dripped acid, each syllable a lash against the SEAL's calm. The SEAL lowered his gaze slowly, eyes dropping to his calloused palms, thick, rough, darkened patches that spoke in a language of gunpowder, grit, and moonless operations. He ran his thumb across the hardened skin, a soft, almost reverent movement, as though tracing the ghost of every bullet, every enemy line crossed in the dead of night. Under his breath, he murmured in a low, echoing cadence, "I don't want to return to that place, not for someone like you." The officer chuckled, the sound thin and sharp as broken glass, and started rolling his wrists. Bones cracked one after another, a grotesque symphony that filled the air with the stench of arrogance and violence. His fingers flexed, curling and uncurling, as if counting down to an explosion that only he believed he could control. His eyes narrowed to slits, gleaming with a sadistic hunger as he wiggled his fingers in a taunt that vibrated with pure contempt. His posture screamed predator, yet beneath the surface, tremors betrayed the brittle core he refused to acknowledge. The SEAL didn't lift his head, didn't flinch at the threat disguised as an invitation. His breath remained steady, a silent metronome ticking in a mind forged beyond the edge of death. The thick tendons on his forearms flexed subtly, veins pulsing with coiled energy, yet his hands stayed lowered, unmoved by the tremors of cheap intimidation. His stillness was louder than a war cry, each second stretching into an eternity that strangled the officer's illusion of dominance. The SEAL's lips barely parted, his jaw clenched with the weight of restraint, a private fortress no outsider could breach. The officer clicked his neck from side to side, knuckles cracking like small detonations echoing in a bunker. "What's wrong? Cat got your courage, hero?" He snarled, words coiling around his tongue like venomous snakes. But the SEAL remained grounded, the air around him humming with a silent promise of power that needed no fanfare. His fingers twitched briefly, a flicker of history shimmering just beneath his skin, the echo of every enemy he had disarmed, every friend he had carried bleeding through enemy fire. That slight twitch told stories of thunderous deserts, steel rain, and brothers lost beneath red skies. The SEAL continued his inspection of his hand, as if the officer's taunts were whispers carried by a dying breeze. The ridges and scars on his palm shone under the harsh fluorescent lights, each one a badge far more real than any medal pinned to a chest. In that small act, he reduced the officer's posturing to dust, made his threats look like a child's tantrum against an unyielding mountain. Every movement of the SEAL was minimal, deliberate, each pause like a loaded chamber waiting for a trigger that would never be pulled by someone so hollow. The officer snapped his fingers repeatedly, the sound sharp and brittle, desperate to fill the void that swallowed his authority whole. He leaned even closer, jaw tight, breath sour with cowardice. He dressed as bravado. His eyes darted for a fraction of a second to the SEAL's eyes, hoping for a crack, a flinch, a twitch, but all he found was a silent abyss. The SEAL finally looked up, eyes glacial and infinite, a mirror showing the officer his smallness. That gaze stripped flesh from bone, exposing every lie he had ever told himself about power, about fear, about what it meant to be unbreakable. No words were needed. The SEAL's hand lowered slowly to his side, fingers uncurling, palm open, as if to show the universe the only weapon he ever needed. His unwavering will, his shoulders squared, his chest expanded with an inhale that felt like the slow pull of a blade from its sheath. Time around them warped, seconds turning molten, breath sticking to throats, too afraid to swallow. The officer recoiled half a step, a subtle retreat hidden behind the smirk he tried to salvage. But his laughter now was a hollow drum, echoing in a hall already claimed by the SEAL's silent reign. In that heartbeat of space, the courtroom became a stage stripped of props and masks, leaving only two men, one armored in hollow noise, the other sculpted by silent storms. Every crack in the officer's fingers, every roll of his neck, every poisoned word, all of it crumbled beneath the weight of the SEAL's absolute stillness. It was a standoff beyond fists and threats. It was spirit against shadow, legacy against echo, and even without a blow, the outcome was already written across the tremor crawling up the officer's spine. The electric tension from the last breath hung heavy as the officer feigned a retreat, stepping back with a slithering smirk curling across his lips. In an instant, he lunged forward, shoving his face inches from the SEAL's. His spit-laced words tore through the charged silence. "You're nothing but desert trash, crawling around like a stray dog." His breath stank of cheap power, a stench that oozed from every syllable. The SEAL didn't flinch, his pupils locked into the officer's, dissecting every tremor that shivered beneath the snarling bravado. For a heartbeat, the officer's eyes flickered, a microspasm of terror buried under his hollow cruelty, a glimpse of a child drowning behind a mask of venom. The SEAL's fingers curled slowly, each knuckle cracking under an invisible weight, his nails pressed into his palm, puncturing skin with silent finality. A thin line of blood beaded, bright and viciously red, dripping onto the polished floor like a war drum's first strike. That single drop shattered any illusion of control the officer pretended to hold. The SEAL's jaw set like a fortress, his breath measured, deep, every inhale a vow, every exhale a silent verdict. He lowered his voice to a ground-shaking whisper, the words molten iron rolling off his tongue. "I swore to protect this country, even when it betrayed me." The officer's head jerked back slightly, his grin faltering, swallowed by the cavernous void staring back at him. His fists clenched tighter, fingers twitching as if begging for an excuse to explode, but his spine refused to obey. The SEAL's blood traced a thin scarlet path down his wrist, pooling at his fingertips before slipping onto the floor in sharp, rhythmic splashes. Each drop sang a hymn of self-restraint, a brutal melody of a man who had held back storms no mortal could imagine. The SEAL's gaze stayed locked, pinning the officer like a nail through glass. In that searing stare, he saw the cowardice fermenting beneath the uniform, the fractures spiderwebbing through his ego. The air between them thickened, humming with static that threatened to erupt with every second stretched too far. The SEAL's arm trembled once, not from fear, but from the colossal effort it took to cage a beast built by decades of war and discipline. That blood, bright as a battlefield dawn, became a symbol far more powerful than any weapon, a crimson reminder of the iron code pulsing through his veins. The officer forced a laugh, the sound breaking into shards before it left his throat. He leaned in again, breath hitching, his voice turning sharp as a blade dipped in acid. "Look at you, bleeding for what? For ghosts? You're just a broken relic clinging to faded glory." But his words fell into the void between them, bouncing off the wall of resolve that the SEAL embodied. No twitch of an eyebrow, no flinch of a lip, only a slow, steady burn in his stare that scorched the air itself. The SEAL's blood continued its silent testimony, dotting the floor in a quiet procession that mocked the officer's entire arsenal of insults. He didn't bother wiping it, didn't bother shielding it. He offered it as proof, a living oath etched into flesh. His silence roared, each heartbeat echoing like a war chant that rattled the officer's marrow. The SEAL's voice, when it finally came again, cut through the room like lightning ripping the sky. Your words are bullets fired from an empty chamber. The officer's shoulders twitched, fingers spreading wide as though ready to swing, but his feet refused to move. His bravado turned to a tremor, his breath catching on the cliffs of panic. The SEAL took a single step forward, the motion deliberate, a tectonic shift that tilted the room's gravity. That step alone collapsed every wall the officer had ever built around his fragile kingdom. His eyes widened, the mask of arrogance cracking, leaking terror like water from a broken dam. The SEAL didn't strike, didn't raise a fist. He stood, blood dripping, eyes unblinking, spine unbowed, a monument to unyielding conviction. The room, electrified beyond reason, felt the unseen quake. Every drop of that blood spelled out the same chilling promise. There are worse fates than fists. The officer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing violently, the room swallowing the echoes of his shallow breath. In that suspended heartbeat, the SEAL's silent dominance consumed the space, reducing every threat to ash before a match was even struck. No one moved, no one dared. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was the inner sanctum of a warrior's soul, and only one man was worthy to stand in it. The SEAL didn't need to prove his power. His existence alone was a verdict written in blood, pain, and unbreakable oaths. The last echo of blood dripping hadn't even vanished when the officer erupted, a guttural roar tearing from his throat like a predator cornered in its lair. "You don't belong here, criminal!" he spat, each word launched like a dagger aimed to pierce dignity itself. In one brutal surge, he swung his leg forward, all his weight coiled into a single, reckless kick designed to break bones and shatter resolve. The SEAL bent at the waist with surgical precision, arms sweeping across his abdomen to absorb the incoming force. The impact slammed against his forearm and ribs, vibrating through his frame like a metal hammer striking an anvil. His feet stayed planted, spine upright, a steel pillar rooted in bedrock. The courtroom seemed to freeze mid-breath, the collective air sucked away, as if the walls themselves recoiled. The officer's face twisted into a savage grin, his teeth bared, pupils wild. The laugh that followed rang sharp as shrapnel in a narrow alley. "You're not tough enough, are you?" he howled, voice splintering with manic glee. But the SEAL didn't stagger. Instead, his head lifted slowly, eyes catching the overhead lights and reflecting them as lethal shards. His neck tendons bulged, cords of power crawling beneath his skin like coiled cables, his jawline sharpening into a blade honed by years of silent battles. A single deep breath rumbled through his chest, a sound as heavy as a gun chamber snapping shut. The officer took a half-step back, triumph bleeding from his eyes, replaced by a glint of hesitation he couldn't mask. The SEAL's gaze sliced through him with the accuracy of a sniper's bullet, dissecting every layer of his bravado in one merciless sweep. The room felt like it shrank, sucked into the gravitational pull of that stare, walls closing in as every witness felt their pulse match the silent war drum inside his ribs. The SEAL exhaled at last, the sound a slow, controlled thud, echoing from a place deeper than rage, the kind of exhale that came only from those who had walked through fire and returned unburnt. "That's all you've got?" His voice dropped into a gravelly register, each word snapping through the air like suppressed gunfire. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict, a quiet evisceration that dismantled the officer's entire illusion in a single breath. Every syllable dripped with disdain sharp enough to flay skin from bone, leaving the officer naked in front of his fragile ego. The officer blinked rapidly, his body stuttering, as though his mind had lost the map back to dominance. His laugh faltered into an unsteady wheeze, shoulders trembling under a weight he had never trained to carry. He shuffled backward, hands twitching at his sides, desperate to find an anchor in the storm he had summoned, but never prepared to weather. The SEAL's spine remained rigid, shoulders squared, chin level, an immovable monument in a room flooded by fear and collapsing bravado. A vein throbbed down the SEAL's neck, stark against the dark canvas of his skin, pulsing with the primal hum of controlled violence. His face, momentarily twisted from the blow, realigned into an expression of cold serenity that threatened to suffocate any further defiance. The officer's eyes darted to the SEAL's feet, perhaps hoping to find a crack, a sign of instability, but the SEAL stood as if carved from obsidian, unyielding to both force and mockery. Each second dragged like an iron chain across stone, the air heavy with the scent of fear and sweat. The officer's earlier confidence leaked out of him, leaving only a quivering husk masked by forced laughter. His head tilted forward, as though begging for acknowledgement, but the SEAL offered nothing, not a flinch, not a nod, only that unwavering, cold, dissecting gaze. The SEAL didn't need a counterstrike. He had already broken the man without lifting a fist. His silence roared across the courtroom, a gale that tore through every pretense, leaving behind only raw, naked defeat. In that final frame, the officer looked smaller than ever, his body hunched, eyes glassy, as if staring down a nightmare he couldn't escape. Meanwhile, the SEAL's form radiated an almost mythical stillness, the faint tremor of his neck vein the only sign of the storm harnessed beneath the surface. He embodied a calm so lethal it mocked the chaos around him. The courtroom, once filled with breathless gasps, now throbbed with a hushed awe, each spectator chained to the unfolding spectacle. With the room hanging by a thread, the SEAL's shoulders barely rose, as if shrugging off the physical insult as a fly's touch. His exhale curled through the tense air, carrying a final, quiet devastation. "Is that all you've got?" he repeated, softer now, each word a blade carving across the officer's already shattered defenses. The echo of that challenge reverberated in the chamber long after the sound itself had died, searing into memory as a testament to true, unbreakable power. The SEAL's final question still echoed, hanging above the officer like a blade waiting to drop. Without a tremor, he straightened his back, vertebrae aligning into an unbreakable column. His hand drifted slowly to his abdomen, fingertips brushing the fresh bruise where the kick had landed, as if acknowledging the pain but refusing to surrender an inch. He inhaled deeply, the air hissing into his lungs like a forge swallowing molten metal, every breath loaded with an entire lifetime of battlefields and silent sacrifices. The exhale rolled out thick and heavy, a fog drifting across a midnight war zone, seeping into the walls and coiling around the onlookers' throats. The officer watched, face blanching from rage red to corpse pale, his eyes wide, lost between fight and flight, unable to choose either path. The SEAL's gaze drilled into him, unwavering, merciless, cold enough to snap bone. The SEAL's voice rose, low and ironclad, each word fired with the precision of a sniper's round. "I served 3 tours for this country." The syllables cracked through the courtroom, slamming into the officer's skull like steel stakes. No flourish, no theatrics, just raw, pure weight that crushed every last molecule of his defiance. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the room broke the silence, but it vanished instantly, devoured by the void between these two men. The officer's lips twitched, corners quivering as if trying to shape another insult, but nothing emerged. His heels scraped backward, a reflexive retreat that sliced away the last scrap of his manufactured bravado. The SEAL advanced a half step, slow and deliberate, his breath as steady as a midnight tide grinding cliffs into sand. His presence swallowed space, forcing the officer to taste every drop of the fear he had once poured into others. The SEAL didn't blink. His stare pinned the officer in place, an invisible spear skewering him to the polished floor. His ribs rose and fell with majestic calm, each breath a silent testament to decades spent facing death without blinking. He leaned in just enough for his words to slice directly into the officer's shrinking soul. "You're not worthy enough to make me kneel." His voice fell like a guillotine, every vowel sharp enough to sever illusions, every consonant ringing like hammer blows against a war drum. The officer's knees buckled slightly, a micro-quake of bone and shame. He swallowed hard, Adam's apple jumping like a startled animal, his breath coming in ragged, uneven slices. Every inch of him trembled, haunted by the realization that he was standing before a force he could neither comprehend nor dismantle. Meanwhile, the SEAL's silhouette grew larger without moving, a towering ghost forged from endless dunes, iron discipline, and unyielding loyalty. The SEAL's chest expanded once more, this time his breath flowing out thicker, coiling through the air like dark smoke crawling across a scorched battlefield. The scent of sweat and adrenaline melded into something almost sacred, a living shrine to sacrifice and spine. He stood unwavering, his bruised side a silent badge rather than a weakness. Every scar across his skin vibrated with an energy that dared anyone to question his fortitude. The officer's hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling into useless claws, his pupils dilating wildly. searching for an escape that no longer existed. His jaw slackened, words pooling at the back of his throat, too heavy to spit out, too brittle to shape into defense. His gaze flickered downward, unconsciously acknowledging the towering presence before him as an apex entity beyond his reach. The seal's eyes never left their mark, two smoldering coals glowing with the fury of 1,000 silent storms. Each second stretched into an eternity, the room suffocating under the weight of that immovable will. The officer sagged slightly, his bones folding inward as if trying to vanish into himself. The seal remained a silent monument, his body language screaming a challenge more powerful than any fist or bullet. "Try me." No one dared breathe. Every observer felt the drag of gravity pulling them into that clash of souls, hearts thudding like distant mortars. The seal's final exhale came slow and deep, misting the space between them, a phantom fog rolling off a midnight ocean. He didn't need to raise his hands. His words alone had become the blade, the bullet, the unstoppable force. And in that unbroken moment, the world knew. This man could not be moved by any kick, any insult, any cheap performance. He was carved from something beyond flesh, a creed heavier than stone, sharper than any edge, eternal as the wars he carried in his veins. The seal's breath still hovered like a phantom storm when his hand moved, a deliberate glacial slide to his chest pocket. The room seemed to contract, the walls trembling under the weight of an unseen avalanche as his fingers grasped something hidden, an object that hummed with silent power. With a swift, fluid pull, he drew it out, a military ID card, battered, edges roughened like scars sliced across a battlefield. Its surface glinted, flashes of silver and deep scratches catching every shard of light like war medals catching gunfire at dawn. The seal lifted it high, his arms straight, muscles corded with a tension that dared the universe to blink first. His voice erupted, slicing through the officer's already crumbling defenses like a blade-splitting bone. "Read it. I don't need a dog's mouth to validate me." The words detonated in the air, reverberating off the cold marble, echoing like a war cry ricocheting through a canyon of ghosts. The officer's face collapsed inward, lips parting, jaw slackening until it dangled helplessly. His eyes ballooned, pupils shrinking as if trying to flee the brutal truth reflecting at them. The seal's card shimmered beneath the harsh overhead lights, its embossed letters sparking like stray flares over a dark ocean. U.S. Navy SEAL Decorated Operator. The inscription blazed forth, brighter and louder than any accusation, branding itself onto the officer's mind in molten lines. His hand shot out, gripping the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, tendons twitching, as if he might sink straight through the floor. His knees buckled, spine faltering under the crushing revelation, his entire aura deflating into a hollow shell gasping for meaning. The seal's eyes drilled forward, unwavering, the card becoming a talisman, an unyielding testament to storms weathered and worlds saved. Dust and faint smears of blood clung to the silver edge, the stains a whispered story of loyalty and loss, a litany of lives carried on those broad shoulders. It wasn't just an ID, it was an artifact forged from midnight raids, lost brothers, and promises kept in mud-soaked silence. The officer's throat clicked as he struggled to swallow, face blanching to the hue of spent ash. The seal's fingers tightened around the card, veins flaring across his wrist, every inch of skin roaring with untamed electricity. His stance widened subtly, a primal signal that his very core was an impenetrable fortress. The card stayed aloft, gleaming defiantly, daring the world to challenge the man behind it. A fine tremor shot down the officer's spine, his free hand clawing the table's edge, nails gouging shallow trenches into the polished wood. He tried to form words, lips flapping in desperate spasms, but only pitiful gasps escaped. His eyes flickered wildly, ping-ponging between the seal's unflinching gaze and the card that now hung like an executioner's blade. His aura of predatory dominance had been gutted in a single, ruthless revelation. The seal shifted forward slightly, the movement minimal yet cataclysmic, like a tectonic plate sliding beneath the ocean. His jaw locked, eyes radiating an impossible calm, carved from blood, dust, and midnight oaths. The card glowed in his grasp, a silver beacon pulsing with echoes of thunderous firefights and silent victories that never needed public applause. In that frozen instant, time fractured into shards. The officer's breath rattled like a dying engine, each inhale stuttering against the wall of unspoken defeat. He clung to the table as if it were the last plank on a sinking ship, his entire body screaming surrender, though his mind refused to speak the word. The SEAL didn't move again, didn't lower the card, didn't soften the fire burning in his stare. He did not need to say more. The card spoke volumes in a language older and more savage than any courtroom script. Every scratch on its surface gleamed under the sterile lights, each one a silent roar in the orchestra of scars and sacrifices. The card wasn't just proof of service, it was a living monument, a war-baptized relic wielded by a man who had bled for ideals beyond the comprehension of cowards. The officer's fingers finally slipped, his grip on the table failing, his body lurching forward as though gravity itself had turned traitor. His knees nearly kissed the ground before he caught himself, face twisted into a portrait of raw, naked terror. The SEAL stood rooted, arm extended, card gleaming like a sword tip kissed by dawn. His breath thickened the air, each exhale a reminder that his strength didn't come from words or weapons, but from an unbreakable creed forged far beyond courtroom walls. No further movement was needed. The entire room felt it, the unstoppable collapse of a man who had dared challenge a living storm. And in that silent collapse, the SEAL reigned supreme, his card a gleaming thunderclap that reduced all pretense to ash. The silver glow of the SEAL's card still scorched the air when the officer's lips finally cracked open, the sound no stronger than a dying moth's flutter. "No, you can't be real." His voice splintered into shards, each word a fractured confession bleeding out from a fortress crumbling under its cowardice. His eyes, once vicious slits, now bulged with an ocean of disbelief and raw terror, darting from the SEAL's unblinking stare to the relic of honor still gleaming between the SEAL's fingers. The SEAL lowered the card with glacial precision, every movement deliberate and cruelly calm. He took one slow step forward, each footfall vibrating like distant artillery, each inch conquered without violence, but by sheer gravitational pull. His hand rose, index finger extended, the motion so precise it sliced through the remaining illusion of dominance like a scalpel through decayed flesh. The SEAL's fingertip pressed gently against the officer's chest, the contact almost tender but loaded with the crushing weight of judgment. His voice dropped, low enough to crawl under the officer's skin and coil around his spine. "That's exactly why I'm here," he whispered, each word an iron nail hammered into the officer's ribcage. "Because you believed otherwise. Because you thought you could stand above without ever standing for anything." The officer's breath snagged in his throat, eyes flaring in frantic disbelief, his knees buckling as if the floor beneath him had been yanked away by an invisible hand. He stumbled back, feet skidding across the polished surface, soul squealing like a dying animal's cry. His heel clipped the edge of a bench, and for a breathless moment, he hung suspended in a pathetic dance with gravity before crashing down. His palms slapped the floor first, fingers splayed wide in a final, useless attempt to cling to any semblance of dignity. The smack of skin on marble echoed with pitiless clarity, bouncing off the walls and slicing into every watching heart. A single bead of sweat rolled down from the officer's temple, gliding with excruciating slowness along the curve of his cheek, before slipping from his jaw and hitting the floor with a barely audible tap. It spread outward in a small, dark bloom, a ghostly echo of blood, in a place where no blade had been drawn. That droplet carried the weight of every insult, every sneer, every hollow threat he had thrown like cheap bullets, all dissolved into a puddle of liquid surrender. The SEAL loomed above him, his chest expanding and contracting in a rhythm older than war itself. His silhouette stretched across the fallen man, a towering eclipse that swallowed every flicker of light, every trembling scrap of false valor. His eyes remained fixed on the officer's face, dissecting every twitch, every frantic eye dart, every shallow gasp. He didn't need to move further. The battlefield was already won in the terrain of the mind, in the trenches of the spirit where the officer had never dared to tread. The officer's face, once twisted into snarls and barbed mockery, now contorted with a grotesque blend of pain and revelation. His cheeks flushed, veins crawling like worms beneath the skin, his lips quivering as though trying to shape a plea or a denial, but no sound came. His gaze flickered upward, meeting the SEAL's relentless stare for one devastating heartbeat before collapsing again to the ground, unable to endure the furnace of that unwavering contempt. The SEAL's breath rolled out, heavy and unbroken, each exhale misting the air like a phantom tide rising to consume the last island of pride the officer had left. His frame stayed statuesque, spine locked in an ancient posture of defiance and quiet superiority. The room felt as if it had been sucked into a vacuum, all noise strangled into a collective, choking hush. No movement dared interrupt the silent execution of the officer's fabricated empire. A tremor traveled through the officer's shoulders, his hands splaying wider against the cold floor as if trying to merge with it, to vanish beneath the cracks. His knees quivered violently, face pressing closer to the marble in an unconscious gesture of surrender, each breath now shallow, jittery, laced with the acidic sting of humiliation. His whole body folded in on itself, a fortress collapsing under a single, unspoken truth. The SEAL didn't smirk, didn't flex, didn't spit a final insult. His victory was not in the words nor in the blows, but in the raw, suffocating aura that turned defiance into ash and self-importance into scattered dust. His shadow covered the officer entirely now, a living specter of retribution and silent reproof. There was no need for violence. The psychological blade had already cleaved deeper than any fist could ever dream. In that suspended eternity, the SEAL stood alone, his breathing a quiet drumbeat that filled the emptiness. The fallen officer remained sprawled, face turned away, eyes squeezed shut against a reality too monstrous to face. And above him, the SEAL's eyes gleamed not with triumph, but with a final, crushing judgment that thundered louder than any roar. He had proven his creed, not with a punch, but with a presence that would haunt the officer's marrow until the end of his days. The echo of the officer's shattered mask still haunted the air when the SEAL finally moved, his breath rolling slow and heavy, each exhale thick as the midnight fog crawling over a battlefield. He tilted his head just slightly, eyes narrowing with a serenity that felt more fatal than any blade. His voice rose, low and weighted, a rumble from deep within the earth itself. "I don't strike you because you deserve to be struck by the law itself." The words cracked through the silence like lightning across a moonless sky, each syllable a hammer blow shattering the last illusions of power clinging to the officer's trembling frame. With a measured turn, the SEAL extended his arm toward the judge, his fingers curled around the military ID card that still shimmered with its battle-scarred glow. He didn't look at the judge, didn't need to. The act itself spoke in a language older than the courtroom, a silent decree of honor and absolute authority. He offered it not as a plea, but as a blade of truth, a final nail in the coffin of lies that had just collapsed around them. The officer's voice exploded, cracking apart with a hysteria that splashed desperation across the polished floor. "He's going to kill me! He's dangerous! Arrest him, please!" His words shrieked like metal scraping bone, an animal's last screech before being devoured. His hands clawed at the empty air, fingernails curling like broken hooks, eyes darting around the room in a wild, drowning panic. But no one moved to save him. The SEAL stood firm, an immovable statue carved from war and oaths unbroken, his breath now silent but booming inside every soul watching. Slowly, the SEAL's eyelids lowered, shutting out the chaotic tremors around him. His head bowed just slightly, a controlled dip that echoed ancient warriors honoring fallen brothers before battle. The silence swallowed the courtroom whole, a suffocating blanket that pressed into every chest, tightening every throat. His next words slithered into that stillness, cold and sharp as an Arctic blade. "Dangerous?" he echoed, almost a whisper, each letter dipped in quiet scorn. He shook his head once, slow, final, as if erasing the officer's last plea from existence. "You ripped your mask off. I only stood here." The officer choked on a half-sob, fingers still clawing at ghosts only he could see, the room spinning around his crumbling spirit. His knees collapsed inward again, spine buckling as though the very marrow had been sucked from his bones. Every eye in the room clung to the SEAL, drawn into a gravitational pull so strong it silenced every hidden judgment, every unspoken doubt. The SEAL's chest rose and fell with a rhythm as deep and ancient as the ocean's tides, each inhale a hymn to loyalty, each exhale a verdict older than any gavel. His face remained a chiseled monument of calm rage, a storm coiled within stone, waiting to be summoned but forever in control. The judge reached forward slowly, hesitating, as if touching a sacred artifact when taking the SEAL's card. Their fingers barely brushed, the contact so fleeting it felt like a passing ghost, but the impact sent tremors across the room's collective spine. As the judge drew the card closer, the SEAL's hands dropped back to his sides, fingers uncurling into silent talons of restraint. His eyes remained closed, head still bowed, as though attending a sacred ritual no one else could understand. In that suspended breath, the courtroom ceased to be a room of law and turned into a cathedral of raw truth, with the SEAL standing as both priest and executioner. His presence alone declared a sentence more binding than any official decree, etching it into the bones of every witness. The officer let out another strangled wail, the sound scraping along the floor like a rusted blade. His face twisted, eyes leaking terror in place of tears, the last threads of his humanity snapping one by one. The SEAL remained silent, his posture a sermon on the difference between power and force, between noise and true authority. He didn't need to repeat his judgment. His stillness sang it louder than any scream. In that final frame, the SEAL stood alone in his quiet thunder, eyelids heavy but unbowed, head bowed but undefeated. The world outside seemed to vanish, shrinking into nothing but the space between two men, one on the floor, drowning in his lies, the other a living testament to a code written in blood and silence. And in that hush that followed, everyone understood that no chains, no insults, no courtroom antics could ever diminish a man who had already faced the abyss and chosen to stand tall within it. The silence born from the SEAL's final words still pulsed through the courtroom like an aftershock when the officer lunged forward, his fingers clawing at the air as though grasping for a lifeline already lost to the abyss. His eyes blazed with a final, desperate hatred, pupils wild and unfocused, as if trying to find an anchor in a storm he had summoned but could never command. His hand shot out toward the SEAL's chest, knuckles whitening, veins bulging beneath the skin, each muscle fiber twitching with a suicidal resolve. But the SEAL did not move, did not sway, his feet planted in a calm that radiated an almost otherworldly permanence. The officer's fist rose higher, hovering inches from the SEAL's uniform, trembling like a white flag shredded in a hurricane. For a heartbeat, the courtroom stood suspended in a purgatory of possibilities, each second stretching into a razor-thin eternity. The SEAL's gaze locked onto the officer's face, eyes dark and bottomless, draining the last drops of defiance from the man's bones. His breathing remained even, slow, each inhale an echo of forgotten battlefields, each exhale a silent decree of supremacy. The officer's wrist began to quiver, the tremor cascading up his forearm and into his shoulder, his entire frame rattling as if each joint had lost its memory of strength. His lips parted, breath coming in shallow rasps that sounded more like confessions than curses. The momentum behind his strike withered in midair, his arm drooping, fingers unclenching in a pitiful spasm of surrender. The finality of that collapse reverberated through the room, louder than any scream or gunshot could ever be. His hand dropped to his side, slack and lifeless, falling as though gravity had turned traitor. He stumbled backward a half step before his knees buckled outright, crashing to the floor with a thud that rang across the walls like a gavel sealing an irreversible verdict. His palms slapped the ground first, elbows folding under the sudden dead weight of his upper body, chin smacking the marble with a dull crack. His entire figure spread across the cold floor, a broken marionette cut from its final string. His voice leaked out, thin and shredded, barely strong enough to cross the small space between them. I can't win. The words spilled from his mouth like poison from a cracked vial, seeping into the stone beneath him. His face turned upward, eyes climbing the SEAL's towering frame until they reached that face carved from cold resolve. What he saw there was not rage, not even victory, only a glacial contempt, a disdain so pure it felt like an abyss staring back. The SEAL stood unmoved, his body devoid of sweat, each muscle relaxed yet somehow more imposing than if flexed in combat. His expression remained untouched by triumph, lips pressed into a flat line that spoke of a higher law, a code unshakable by brute force or trembling pleas. The officer's eyes locked with the SEAL's for a final shattering instant, pupils shrinking under the unblinking judgment that poured down on him like an endless winter storm. The room seemed to vanish around them, the walls dissolving into a vacuum where only two men existed, one upright, one broken. The officer's fingers twitched across the floor, as if trying to drag himself away from the weight of that gaze. But no salvation waited in any direction. His spine curved inward, folding on itself in a last pathetic cocoon of self-preservation. Yet even that refuge offered no escape from the silent verdict etched across the SEAL's eyes. The officer's mouth flapped once more, silent now, lips tracing words his soul no longer dared to pronounce. His eyelids fluttered, lashes trembling like moth wings pinned to glass. At last his head dropped forward, chin nearly kissing the ground, breath stuttering in disjointed shallow pulses. His entire body sagged into a shape more corpse than man. His spirit bled out not by violence, but by the sheer gravitational crush of a presence he had never imagined possible. Above him, the SEAL remained motionless, each second of his stillness a towering monument to restraint and controlled wrath. His hands hung loosely at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as though always prepared yet forever unneeded. His eyes, empty of fire, glowed instead with a cold finality that no weapon could match. In that frozen tableau, the officer became nothing more than a husk, a discarded uniform filled with echoes of cowardice and hollow threats. And when the officer finally collapsed entirely, forehead pressing into the floor, his last broken gasp was swallowed by the heavy silent sibilance owned and commanded by the SEAL alone. No movement followed, no words dared intrude. In that instant, the SEAL's mere existence became the final blow, more devastating than any fist or bullet ever could be. The SEAL stood unmoving over the broken officer, the charged silence gnawing at every breath in the room. His eyes scanned the man beneath him one last time, not as an enemy, but as something already discarded by history. Slowly, he turned his body, the movement smooth and deliberate, like a mountain shifting after centuries of stillness. He stepped forward, his boots pressing against the marble with the quiet gravity of final judgment. His head tilted slightly, shoulders relaxed, but pulsing with untamed strength, every line in his posture whispering a single truth. There was nothing left to prove. His voice rose, measured and thunderous in its calm, slicing the air sharper than any blade. "I've put down terrorists with guns. You only have your mouth." Each word landed like a hammer on stone, echoing through the marrow of everyone within earshot. The officer, collapsed and shivering, spat out a last feeble attempt at resistance, his words dissolving before they fully formed. "Arrest him. He's a criminal. He'll kill us all." His voice screeched upward, raw and empty, scattering across the chamber like broken glass. But the room answered with silence. Not a single hand moved toward a weapon. Not a single foot stepped forward. Instead, eyes locked on the SEAL, their collective focus swallowing the officer's frantic shrieks like a black hole devours light. The SEAL didn't look back. His gaze had already left the trembling wreck behind, climbing higher, past benches and marble arches, past the brittle cries of false authority, until it anchored on the flag above. The flag hung solemn and still, draped in quiet dignity above the courtroom's chaos. Light filtered through a high window, spilling down its stripes, casting a pale brilliance that splashed across the SEAL's shoulder. He raised his right hand in a crisp, perfect salute, fingers rigid, palm angled just so, an eternal gesture born of countless dawn formations, of brothers lost, of promises inked in blood and silence. In that second, he became more than a soldier, more than a man. He became a living embodiment of the very ideals that the flag claimed to represent. The officer's sobs turned into choked gasps, his arms pulling inward as if to shield himself from a radiance too blinding to endure. The SEAL held his salute steady, eyes fixed on the flag, a connection so fierce it scorched the air between them. His breath deepened, expanding his chest like a silent anthem echoing across a battlefield. The veins on his forearm popped under his skin, each tendon screaming the weight of battles fought and honor carried alone. The courtroom, once echoing with shouts and threats, felt like a sacred chamber. Every spectator felt the electricity pouring off that single gesture, an invisible wave crashing through bones and marrow. They saw not just a warrior, but a monument, a reminder that true power doesn't scream. It stands. It salutes when lesser men crumble. It embodies the promise to stand unmoved, even when faced with betrayal and cowardice. The seal's fingers never twitched, his wrist unyielding, his silhouette framed by that draped flag and the shard of light slicing across his shoulders like a divine brand. His chin remained level, jaw set, eyes burning with a loyalty so deep it silenced even the most cynical heart. In that image, time seemed to fracture. The officer below him blurred into a forgotten smudge, his wails and accusations dissolving into static at the edges of reality. The finality of the scene fell on the room like a steel door slamming shut. No gavel struck. No judge needed to rise. The verdict had already been carved into every heart present. This man did not need fists, did not need to lower himself to the soil where cowards grovel. He only needed to stand, and by standing, he had conquered. His victory resounded in the silence, louder than any cheer or verdict could hope to achieve. The seal's salute remained frozen in the air, a blade held aloft in reverence, his face locked into an expression both serene and ruthless. Above him, the flag rippled once, as though offering a final nod to its unwavering sentinel. That singular frame, the raised hand, the straight spine, the flag burning in solemn glow behind him, etched itself into every witness's memory as an immortal painting, a testament to the triumph of quiet strength over hollow noise. As the seal finally lowered his hand, each finger moving with slow precision, the air shivered, a collective breath held and released by an audience trapped between reverence and disbelief. He turned his head slightly, the last flicker of light catching the edge of his jaw, revealing not rage nor pride, but an impenetrable calm that no insult could pierce. In that parting heartbeat, the entire courtroom knew one absolute, irrefutable truth. He had won long before he ever stepped inside. And with that knowledge, they hungered to see what step he would take next, what quiet hurricane he would become beyond those walls. The last echo of the seal's solemn salute still pulsed through the marrow of the room when the officer began to stir. His hands clawed at the cold floor, fingers scraping across the marble with a pitiful screech that sounded more like a wounded animal than a man. His shoulders heaved, ribs caving and expanding in ragged gasps as he tried to summon enough strength to rise. His knees wobbled violently beneath him, each joint betraying the facade of authority he had so carefully constructed. Slowly, painfully, he dragged himself halfway upright, swaying like a felled tree refusing to fully collapse. He lunged toward the exit, eyes wide and hollow, pupils shrunken into terrified pinpricks, but his legs betrayed him again, muscles locking mid-step, forcing him to freeze in a grotesque imitation of flight. A tremor shot through his thighs, climbing his spine and spilling into his hands, which flailed helplessly in the empty air. His knees buckled and crashed to the floor, the slap echoing across the room with the finality of a gunshot. He remained there, breathless, shivering, head tilted back toward the ceiling as if searching for salvation among the distant rafters. "Don't look at me! Don't turn around!" he howled, his voice shredding into hysterical fragments. The words ricocheted against the walls, each repetition emptier than the last, dissolving into a cacophony of broken pride and suffocating dread. Cameras flickered to life all around him, flashes searing through the heavy air in rapid, merciless bursts. The white strobe of exposure illuminated every trembling muscle, every droplet of sweat clinging to his hairline, every quiver of his lips struggling to form new lies. His hands shot up to shield his face, fingers spread as if they might conjure an invisible shield to block the world's gaze. But no hand, no badge, no uniform could protect him now. Behind him, the seal stood unflinching, his silhouette towering and unyielding, his eyes narrowed into sharp slits, each eyelash a blade slicing through the atmosphere. He watched the officer not with rage, but with the cold, precise focus of a sniper steadying his scope before a clean shot. His chest rose and fell with impeccable control, the slow rhythm of a predator choosing patience over frenzy. In that frozen moment, he embodied the silent hurricane, every tendon holding back an entire battlefield's worth of wrath. A journalist's voice cracked through the electric air, high and trembling. "Sir, are you going to press charges?" The words rang like a desperate drumbeat, trying to break the suffocating tension coiled around every breath. The seal didn't move, didn't lower his gaze to the camera's lens. He tilted his chin ever so slightly, the motion a glacier shifting in its sleep. His eyes flickered once to the officer, then forward again, anchoring to some invisible horizon only he could see. Finally, his head dipped in a single, solemn nod. The law will finish what it started. His words thundered without volume, each syllable dragging an unspoken gavel down the officer's spine. The officer let out a choking sob, the sound flailing between a cry and a scream. His torso pitched forward, arms clutching at his stomach as though trying to hold in a pain that clawed from the inside out. His shoulders convulsed in sharp spasms, each jolt sending a tremor across the sweat-soaked uniform now clinging to his skin like a death shroud. His fingers curled into the floor, nails scraping thin crescents into the marble as if he might burrow through the earth itself to escape. The SEAL's hands remained relaxed at his sides, though his fingers twitched once, a quiet reminder that violence was always an option, just not a necessity today. His shadow stretched across the floor, draping over the crumpled officer like a shroud woven from midnight and thunder. That silhouette swallowed the last embers of the officer's defiance, devouring the final illusions he had used to hide from his weakness. The flashes kept coming, each burst capturing a new layer of the officer's collapse. The quivering lips, the convulsing shoulders, the eyes rolling back in silent horror. The room felt suspended, every heartbeat a taut string on the edge of snapping. Nobody moved. Nobody dared interrupt the quiet violence unfolding before them. Even the air seemed to recoil, sucked toward the center of that unbreakable presence. The officer's voice dropped to a whisper, words leaking from his mouth like blood from an open wound. "Please, don't look. I can't. I'm not." The confession spilled without shape, each fragment a splinter of his shattered pride. He shuddered once more, then sagged forward, forehead nearly touching the ground, breaths coming in jagged gasps. In that posture, he resembled a man kneeling before an executioner, but the blade never had to fall. The SEAL's eyes hardened, narrowing further, as if sight itself had turned into a weapon. His expression was unflinching, lips pressed into a thin line, jaw chiseled from the same stone that bore ancient warrior statues. He didn't need to move forward or raise a hand. His silent judgment had already struck deeper than any blade. His entire being radiated a calm so potent it bordered on the divine, an unwavering resolve that no bullet or scream could ever fracture. For the first time, the officer truly felt what it meant to be prey to tremble, not from imminent violence, but from the simple, unrelenting certainty that he had already lost. His head jerked up once more, eyes darting to the SEAL's face, but instead of rage, instead of human emotion he might plead against, he found only an infinite void of icy disdain. That gaze swallowed his final plea, crushing it beneath the glacier of indifference that had been earned in deserts, jungles, and silent dawn raids, far beyond civilian nightmares. The room stayed frozen around them, the world outside fading into a distant echo. The officer's arms gave out at last, his forehead kissing the floor in a final, pitiful bow. His breaths came in shivering waves, each inhale shallower than the last, as if his lungs could no longer bear the weight of their existence. The SEAL didn't waver, didn't offer even a flicker of acknowledgement. His presence alone continued to grind down the last fragments of the officer's self-image, until all that remained was a hollow husk gasping on the floor. A single bead of sweat trickled from the SEAL's temple, snaking down the curve of his jaw before vanishing into the collar of his shirt. But even that seemed deliberate, controlled, as though every drop was a calculated act of war. His fists curled slightly, not in preparation for violence, but as a silent punctuation to a sentence already finished in the air around them. That subtle flex whispered to the broken man below, "I could have. I chose not to." In that timeless interval, every flash from the cameras felt like a blade slicing open the officer's final defenses, each burst of light a nail in the coffin of his authority. The SEAL's silhouette loomed larger than life, an unyielding wall of purpose and unspoken oaths. His breaths came in even intervals, each one a metronome counting down the seconds until the final collapse. When it came, it was quiet, almost anticlimactic. The officer's hands slid out from beneath him, body folding flat against the cold marble, shoulders shaking as a sob tore free from his chest and echoed in the now suffocating silence. The SEAL remained still, watching through narrowed eyes as the man below him dissolved into a puddle of discarded pride. His fingers slowly relaxed again, arms hanging loose but radiating the same caged power that had haunted every step of this battle. The flash of the cameras continued, but they no longer captured a warrior versus a challenger. They captured a funeral, the burial of a reputation, a soul, a myth that had already decayed long before this day arrived. And in that final, breathless moment, the SEAL's eyes softened, just slightly, the barest flicker of humanity beneath the glacial surface. But it wasn't mercy. It was a final, silent verdict. You are beneath even my rage. The officer lay sprawled in his puddle of broken breath when the judge finally rose, his robe shifting with a subtle authority that cracked through the heavy air like a silent whip. His face, carved in the cold marble of law, shifted slowly from the SEAL to the disgraced man on the floor. His lips parted, and his voice erupted through the chamber with the resonant clarity of a cathedral bell striking midnight. This officer is hereby placed under immediate arrest for assault within this courtroom and for insulting the honor of a decorated military officer. Each word landed like an iron gauntlet smashing into the fragile skull of the fallen authority figure, ringing out with no room for protest, no corner left for escape. The officer's head snapped up, eyes flooding with wild, primal terror. His mouth fumbled open, tongue heavy, spitting a final pathetic attempt at control. I am the law. You can't do this. I am the law. The words burst out in shrill, animalistic shrieks, echoing across the walls like a dying hyena's cackle. His arms jerked forward, clawing at the polished floor, fingernails squealing in thin, sharp lines that left shallow grooves as he tried to crawl away from the tidal wave of justice crashing over him. The SEAL remained still, a dark monolith etched against the courthouse walls, his head tilting to the side in a slow, deliberate motion that dripped with unspoken superiority. His lips curved into a faint, razor-sharp smile, a subtle show of amusement so cold it scorched the officer's last shreds of sanity. You're nothing but a shell, he drawled, voice smooth as oil over steel. I'm the core. The words flowed from him with effortless dominance, slicing into the officer's fragile ego and peeling away the remaining layers of delusion. Two fellow officers stepped forward, their boots clicking sharply against the floor in a rhythm that felt more like a war drum than mere footsteps. They exchanged a single glance, an entire conversation of disappointment, disbelief, and final acceptance compressed into a flicker of eye contact. Their jaws set, shoulders stiffened, and together, as if choreographed in some grim dance, they advanced toward the fallen man. The officer screeched again, voice rising to a broken crescendo. I am the law! I decide who is guilty! You can't touch me! I make the rules! His words spat forth in foamy spasms, each syllable disintegrating on impact, leaving behind only the acrid stench of lost authority. His hands flailed, pushing at invisible walls, feet kicking against the cold floor, with the desperate energy of a drowning man grasping for air that no longer existed. The approaching officers didn't break stride. One leaned down, eyes hard as obsidian, fingers wrapping around the fallen man's wrists, with a mechanical precision that brooked no negotiation. The other officer mirrored the motion, their movements practiced yet heavy with the finality of betrayal. Together, they dragged the man up, his limbs flopping in uncoordinated spasms, his face a mosaic of horror and disbelief. The SEAL didn't move an inch, his smirk frozen in place, head still tilted as though studying a bug pinned to a specimen board. His eyes shone with an internal flame, not of rage, but of victory so complete it had transcended any need for further action. He watched as the two officers pulled out the cold steel cuffs, the subtle shine catching the courtroom lights like a blade before the final cut. The metallic clack of the cuffs snapped into the room, sharp and echoing, reverberating off every surface like a hammer, striking the final nail into a coffin. The officer's eyes bulged, veins crawling along his neck like frantic serpents, sweat pouring in rivulets down his temples. His head whipped back toward the SEAL, lips trembling as if searching for a final lifeline. But the SEAL offered nothing, no words, no sympathy, not even disdain anymore. Just that unwavering stare that felt more suffocating than any physical restraint. The officers tightened the cuffs with a twist so precise it looked ceremonial, a dark sacrament sealing the fate of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. The disgraced officer sagged, knees threatening to buckle again, his chin dropping to his chest, breath scraping out in ragged, rattling exhalations. His eyes darted about the room, looking for allies that no longer existed, for mercy that had evaporated long before the first insult was hurled. The SEAL let out a quiet, almost imperceptible exhale, the sound rolling across the courtroom like the final breath of a dying storm. He tilted his head back to center, straightened his spine, and in that single motion reclaimed every ounce of air, every gaze, every heartbeat in the space. Without a word, he broadcast a silent sermon. Strength is not the loudest roar, but the silence that remains after every scream has died. The two officers exchanged another look, this one softer, tinged with shame and a resigned duty. Together, they turned, dragging the bound man forward. Each shuffled step sounded like a funeral procession for a kingdom of lies. Each boot scuffed a drumbeat counting down the final seconds of a legacy shattered beyond repair. As the disgraced officer passed by the SEAL, his head jerked up one last time, eyes wide, pupils reduced to trembling pinpoints. In those eyes, the entire downfall played out, the collapse of pride, the implosion of arrogance, the hollow ring of a life built on cheap power now reduced to ash. The SEAL lowered his gaze for a fleeting moment, a flicker of acknowledgement so brief it barely existed, yet powerful enough to seal the man's final descent into oblivion. The courtroom remained deathly silent, every soul caught between horror and reverence, trapped in the gravity of an execution that required no blade, no gun, only truth wielded by a hand steady enough to never tremble. And in that hush, the final clack of the handcuffs hung suspended, echoing like the toll of a cathedral bell marking the hour of ultimate judgment. The final clang of the handcuffs still reverberated in the courtroom when the disgraced officer was yanked forward, his feet dragging behind him like dead weights chained to his shame. His polished shoes screeched against the marble floor, leaving behind two thin, glistening trails that looked almost like blood on a battlefield. His head lolled side to side, mouth twitching with half-formed curses that never gained enough courage to escape fully into the air. Each desperate breath was a ragged plea, a dying hymn to a kingdom of lies that had already crumbled beyond saving. "You'll pay for this. You all will," he snarled, but the words fell flat, thin as smoke against the icy silence of the chamber. His voice cracked on each syllable, rattling like loose bones in an abandoned crypt. His eyes flared wide, darting left and right as though hunting for a last ally in a sea that had long since turned against him. But no eyes met his in solidarity. No hand rose in defense. The man who once swaggered beneath the weight of an unearned badge now found himself swallowed by a void deeper than any cell could provide. The SEAL watched, head tilted slightly, his gaze cold and clinical, as though inspecting a rotting carcass. His lips curled upward, but it was no smile, more a phantom twitch that suggested a mixture of pity and disdain so sharp it could skin a man alive. As the officers dragged their prisoner forward, the fabric of his uniform bunched and strained at the shoulders, tearing with each panic twist of his torso. One final violent jerk split the seam across his back, and with a sound like tearing paper, the once imposing sheriff's shirt sloughed off in ragged sheets. A dull metallic clatter interrupted the hush. The sheriff's badge, now free from its host, skittered across the floor like a dying insect. It spun in small, frantic circles, catching the harsh fluorescent light in trembling reflections before it finally toppled, coming to rest on its edge. The thin ring of metal against stone rang out, a funeral bell marking the death of a reputation already long hollow. The SEAL took a single, deliberate step forward. The echo of his boot heel cut through the room, slicing the moment into something almost sacred. He bent at the waist with the calm of a surgeon, fingers closing around the fallen badge, with a gentleness that felt impossibly intimate. He straightened slowly, lifting the badge to eye level, his gaze narrowing into a scalpel's edge as he studied its surface. The metal's shine was marred by scratches and faint flecks of dust and sweat, the surface no longer a beacon, but a corrupted relic. His breath came out in a slow, controlled exhale, fogging over the cold gleam for a heartbeat before fading into the stale air. His voice rose, soft yet resonant, each word measured and sharp as a blade drawn under moonlight. "A symbol doesn't define honor," he said, almost a whisper yet powerful enough to crush bones. It's the one wearing it who breathes life into its meaning. The disgraced officer's head snapped up, eyes locking on the badge in the SEAL's hand. His lips parted, a silent scream clinging to the edge of his teeth, unable to leap free. His hands twitched behind his back, straining against the cuffs, the chains clinking with a helpless desperation that reverberated across the room like the final beats of a condemned man's heart. The SEAL shifted his wrist, fingers curling tighter around the badge as though he might crush it between thumb and forefinger. But instead of force, he offered only gravity, lowering his arm and letting the badge hang limp at his side for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then, with a flick of his wrist and a final glance at the broken man before him, he hurled the badge into a nearby trash bin. The clank of metal against metal sang through the chamber like a blade, slicing the final strand of a once unbreakable chain. The officer's eyes widened further, a strangled sound sputtering from his throat as he lunged forward, or tried to his knees buckled instantly under the dead weight of his shattered identity. His face contorted, veins bulging across his temples, eyes leaking a silent flood of horror and denial. He slumped forward, forehead colliding with the marble floor with a hollow, reverberating thud that echoed the emptiness in his chest. The SEAL stood straight, shoulders set, chest expanding as he drew in a deep, resolute breath. The light from above cascaded across his silhouette, wrapping him in a stark halo that carved every muscle and line of his face into a living sculpture of power and finality. His hands relaxed at his sides, fingers slightly curled, each knuckle gleaming beneath the harsh lights. His eyes held no victory dance, only a cold, unwavering verdict, unfit. The discarded badge lay motionless in the bin, catching one last glint of light before it vanished beneath a pile of paper and dust. Its surface reflected a final, trembling glow, like a dying star collapsing into darkness. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, each soul locked in an invisible grip that dared not release. In that silence, the SEAL's quiet act spoke louder than any gavel, any sentence, any punishment ever could. With a final tilt of his head, the SEAL turned away from the officer, his movements smooth, unhurried, almost reverential. His spine remained straight, each vertebra locked in the unwavering conviction of a man who had carried entire wars inside his bones. He did not glance back, did not acknowledge the sobs beginning to claw their way out of the officer's mouth like spirits fleeing a burning temple. Every step forward rang out like a war drum, each echo stamping deeper into the floor the message that no uniform, no emblem, no badge ever outweighs the soul wearing it. As he exited the room, the SEAL's shadow stretched across the floor, swallowing the limp figure behind him in an inky shroud of quiet finality. And in that long, endless second before he vanished past the doorframe, the courtroom saw not a man walking away, but a living judgment leaving its mark in silence, forever unchallenged. As the SEAL's final steps faded beyond the courtroom threshold, the world outside erupted into a storm no steel could cage. The video footage, captured from countless angles, had already broken free, slicing through the digital ether like an electrified blade. Screens across America lit up with the footage, the badge clattering into the trash, the broken officer sprawled in silent disgrace, and the SEAL's final, unwavering silhouette framed against the courtroom's sterile lights. The internet didn't just watch, it ignited. The hashtag number #SealSilentStorm detonated across every platform, a digital wildfire consuming timelines with ruthless speed. Millions clicked, millions watched, millions shared, each post a roaring wave pounding against the brittle cliffs of false authority. Above every replayed frame, a single caption echoed with brutal simplicity. He didn't need fists, he needed honor. Those words ricocheted from phone to phone, screen to screen, embedding themselves in the collective consciousness like an unbreakable mantra. Comments flooded beneath every upload. Curses spat like molten lead at the disgraced officer. Declarations of awe and respect hurled at the SEAL. Memes formed in real time, each one a fresh dagger twisting into the rotting corpse of the fallen man's reputation. Former soldiers, retired lawmen, and veterans from distant deserts typed long, trembling paragraphs recounting their wars with betrayal and weak leadership, their stories now overshadowed and renewed by this one man's silent stand. The officer's family found themselves at the center of the digital storm, their profiles overrun by venomous vitriol, every old photograph weaponized, every past post dredged up and reshaped into a spear pointed directly at the heart of their shared shame. Strangers messaged them with searing contempt, their words short and fatal as sniper rounds. "You raised a coward. Dishonor runs deep. He's the rot, and now you are too." The internet was not merciful, nor did it forgive quickly. It bared its fangs and shredded every thread of pretense left in its path. Meanwhile, the SEAL's inbox turned into a silent cathedral echoing with thousands of quiet salutes. Emails, direct messages, encrypted letters all flooded his device in waves as endless as the ocean. His screen glowed non-stop, notifications crawling upward like an unrelenting flood tide. Some messages were short, a single word, respect. Others unfolded like confessions. Entire lives poured into paragraphs thanking him for standing where they couldn't, for holding a line they'd long since lost hope of defending. Former Navy corpsmen, grizzled Marines, old-school SWAT operators, each name carried a ghost of sacrifice. Each word carried a tremor of long-buried loyalty. Yet through it all, the SEAL remained exactly as he had been in the courtroom, still, unreadable, silent. He read each message, his gaze as calm and cutting as a surgical blade, his fingers tapping once against the screen as if confirming a heartbeat before moving on. Now and then, he nodded a slow, deliberate dip of the head so subtle it felt like a tide pulling away from shore, leaving behind only the hard truth of exposed rocks. His phone's glow flickered across his face in the darkness of his small room, each flash sketching him in a new relief, the lines around his eyes deeper, the hard set of his jaw more defined, the shadows beneath his cheekbones, carved from endless nights and unspoken burdens. The hum of the notifications formed a rhythm beneath his breath, a low background chorus to a life already filled with the ghosts of orders followed and brothers lost. He didn't reply. He didn't type. There were no triumphant paragraphs, no proclamations of victory, no indulgence in the adoration showered upon him. His power wasn't in words, but in the marrow-deep silence that radiated from him like a distant thunderhead. Each message was absorbed like a raindrop into a vast ocean of unbroken resolve. Outside, hashtags multiplied. Artists began sketching his silhouette, each piece going viral within minutes, each pencil stroke or digital brush line immortalizing the calm power in his stance, the quiet defiance in his stare. News outlets tried to spin the story, but every attempt was drowned beneath the deafening roar of the people's judgment. Even journalists who tried to play neutral found themselves devoured by comment sections turned into battlefields of digital fury and unwavering loyalty. In the growing dark of his room, the SEAL leaned back, eyes fixed on a single line of text that glowed brighter than any headline. He didn't need fists, he needed honor. The words seemed to hover before him, burning with an almost sacred gravity. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, each breath a final oath whispered into the churning void beyond the walls. His phone vibrated again, screen lighting up with an endless list of new messages, a living scroll of gratitude and rage, confessions and confessions of solidarity. He tilted his head forward slightly, his hand hovering above the screen one final time. The glow reflected off his knuckles, each scar glinting like small defiant stars. Then, with a single, silent nod, he acknowledged it all: the cheers, the curses, the broken confessions, the desperate need for a figure who would not bend. And as that quiet, unassuming gesture sank into the digital sea now raging around his image, the world understood something deeper than any speech or slogan could convey. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it is a single man, alone in a room, nodding once to an army of unseen ghosts. And in that small, almost invisible movement, he reminded them all that honor was never about noise. It was about the unyielding core that remains long after the last echo dies. The digital hurricane didn't stop at the badge, the courtroom, or the walls of the jail. It clawed its way into the corners of the disgraced officer's private life, tearing through each fragile connection with the same ruthless precision he once wielded in the shadows of his uniform. His wife moved swiftly, her silhouette a phantom slipping through the night with a single sheet of paper gripped between two trembling fingers. By sunrise, it sat on the empty kitchen counter, a tombstone for their marriage, ink still wet, spelling out his final exile. The note read only one sentence, each word a dagger: "You were never human." The officer's son faced his crucifixion under the relentless gaze of teenage cruelty. The morning after the courtroom collapse, his classmates cornered him in the hallway, arms tight against his sides, their eyes gleaming with inherited savagery. They ripped photos of his father from his locker, tearing them into confetti before flushing them down the school bathroom toilet, each swirl of water a funeral procession for the boy's last shred of pride. Their laughter echoed off the ceramic walls, a chorus of judgment too sharp for any child to bear. At home, the house that once stood as a symbol of suburban safety and ambition became a public canvas for scorn. Anonymous hands sprayed thick, furious strokes of red paint across every wall, each letter drawn with savage care. COWARD. The paint dripped in slow, fat tears down the brickwork, pooling in the cracks of the walkway like blood from a fresh wound. Neighbors watched from their curtained windows, some recording with trembling hands, others shaking their heads, each one complicit in the silent chorus that pronounced him a traitor to every code he once claimed to uphold. Inside his holding cell, the officer sat in a concrete courtyard surrounded by high fences topped with coiled razor wire. He no longer stood. Instead, he knelt, spine bent so far forward it seemed he was trying to fold into the concrete itself. His hands pressed into the rough ground, fingers clawing at the dirt as though digging a grave for the last fragments of his name. He refused to lift his head, neck locked, chin pressed into his collarbone, as if eye contact with even the sky above might finish him off completely. Around him, the other inmates moved like cautious predators, watching, whispering, their steps careful as though passing a corpse they didn't want to disturb. In another part of the city, the SEAL received the news in quiet pieces, a single line of text about the wife's final words, a brief headline about the boy's humiliation, a grainy photo of the vandalized house. He sat in his room, still and unyielding, only his eyes moving as they traced each sentence. His jaw flexed once, a slow grind of teeth echoing the thunder he kept locked inside. He inhaled deeply, the sound low and steady, filling the small space like a tide creeping up a silent shore. Then he exhaled, voice dropping into the room like a stone into a well. "I only wanted you to stand up the right way." The words weren't a boast or a curse. They held no satisfaction, no cruel edge of victory. They were a eulogy to a man who could have chosen honor but instead drowned in cowardice, dragging everything he loved into the same abyss. His hand dropped to the table beside him, knuckles grazing the smooth surface before curling into a loose fist that never rose, never needed to. Back in the courtyard, rain began to fall in thin, relentless needles, each droplet slicing into the officer's bowed back and rolling down in cold rivulets. He shivered, the water mixing with the sweat and tears on his face until it became impossible to tell them apart. The word "coward," still wet on his front door, now bled down the bricks like red veins, feeding the soil beneath with the poison of a ruined legacy. The SEAL's phone vibrated once more, another message lighting up the screen, this time from an old friend who had shared foxholes and dust-choked dawns. It read simply, "He reaped what he sowed." The SEAL tapped the screen once to acknowledge, eyes steady, expression carved from granite. There was no gloating, only a quiet acceptance that some men build their downfall, brick by brick, lie by lie, until the entire structure crumbles in on itself. As the rain thickened, the officer's knees finally gave way. He slumped sideways into the mud, face pressing against the soaked concrete, breath hitching in shallow gasps. The guards watched from a distance, their eyes hollow, their hands moving to help. His final collapse wasn't met with shouts or applause, only the whisper of rain against metal, a soft requiem to a man no longer worthy of the simplest human dignity. And in a darkened room miles away, the SEAL remained still, every line of his body composed, every breath measured. He did not smile, he did not scowl. His silence thundered louder than any vengeance, echoing through the quiet halls of every home, still holding on to the belief that honor could be faked. The collapse of the villain's family wasn't a spectacle to savor. It was a warning carved into the marrow of a nation. Cowardice will always devour itself from within, leaving only ruins for the wind to scatter. As the last raindrops carved silent trails down the fallen officer's back, the ripples of his collapse surged far beyond the cold courtyard walls. In the marble corridors of the Department of Justice, the story slammed onto polished desks with a force that shattered decades of careful silence. Files once hidden behind locked cabinets were wrenched open under the harsh glow of overhead lights, each sheet a fragile witness dragged screaming into daylight. Names that had been whispered like curses in the shadows now screamed from official reports, each line an indictment of a culture rotten to its marrow. The investigation began as a whisper, a polite tremor among high-backed chairs and starched collars, but within days, it erupted into a maelstrom, shredding alliances and unraveling years of meticulously spun lies. Senior officers who once shared drinks in secret halls now found themselves seated across interrogation tables, sweat dripping down their starched collars, eyes twitching at every question. Some tried to fight back, their words brittle and trembling, collapsing into pitiful excuses before they even crossed their lips. Others, recognizing the futility, dropped their badges onto the gleaming table surfaces, the clink of metal echoing like gunshots in a cathedral. The public watched with a hunger sharpened by betrayal. Headlines blared in crimson fonts, each update feeding the firestorm roaring through living rooms and conference calls alike. Citizens who had long suspected the rot now saw it laid bare, each revelation slicing deeper than any blade. The list of crimes grew like a cancer: falsified evidence, buried complaints, racial profiling documented with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency that turned every letter into a knife. Each file dragged into the light carried the stench of systemic decay, a labyrinth of complicities so wide it swallowed entire careers whole. Colleagues who had once laughed beside the disgraced officer now found themselves under an unrelenting magnifying glass. Summons arrived at their doors before dawn, agents waiting with neutral faces and heavy folders. Inside interrogation rooms lit by buzzing fluorescent bulbs, they squirmed beneath the weight of questions they had long dodged, each answer tightening the noose around their shared facade. Some cracked within minutes, fingers trembling as they signed resignation letters, eyes hollow as they imagined their names smeared across screens and front pages. Others clung to denial, their voices rising into hysterical pitches, splattering desperate protests against walls already soaked in truth. Meanwhile, the SEAL watched from afar, untouched by the chaos he had detonated with a single unwavering stand. He did not attend the hearings. He did not step into the televised panels or accept invitations to primetime interviews that promised hero worship and self-indulgent applause. Instead, he wrote exactly 3 lines on a sheet of stark white paper, each word a blade honed by years of silent discipline. I showed restraint. The law must show no less. Those 12 words stood alone, black ink bleeding into the fibers of the pristine page, like blood blooming across sterile gauze. The report was hand-delivered to a grand meeting hall, where leaders and officials gathered around a table draped in a white linen cloth that seemed to glow under the camera flashes. The paper sat at the center, unadorned, untouchable. Its simplicity burned hotter than any speech or scandal, its weight dragging the entire room into a hush so thick it felt like drowning. Cameras snapped, each click a staccato heartbeat echoing the pulse of a nation realizing that silence, when wielded by the right hands, could split mountains. Protesters filled the streets beyond those walls, their chants turning intersections into echo chambers of fury and grief. Signs flared under street lamps: "Purge the rot, justice for the silent, replace them all." The chorus roared through the veins of the city, shaking skyscraper glass and sending tremors down avenues paved with decades of complicity. Petitions demanded resignations from the entire top echelon of the police force, signatures flooding in by the tens of thousands each hour, each name a silent vow to tear out the roots of betrayal once and for all. Inside the station halls, now stripped of their thin veneer of honor, officers shuffled through empty corridors like ghosts, their faces pale, eyes darting over shoulders as if expecting retribution to materialize from the flicker of each failing hallway light. Locker doors swung open, badges discarded inside like bones in a mass grave. Whispered arguments sputtered through the stale air, each syllable thick with dread and the acidic tang of self-preservation. In offices lined with dusty commendation plaques and faded photographs, commanders stared at resignation letters spread across their desks, each page a quiet confession of cowardice. Hands that once signed orders to destroy lives now trembled over ink pens, sweat dripping onto pages as if each drop carried a fragment of their dying authority. The decision was no longer theirs to make. The tide had already chosen the course, and it devoured all in its path without mercy. And through it all, the SEAL remained motionless in his dimly lit room, the glow of the single report illuminating the granite set of his jaw, the glint in his eyes sharp enough to cut through any remaining illusion. He didn't need to watch it unfold. He had already seen it, felt it in the marrow of every moment he had stood alone in distant sands and concrete jungles. In each breath he had shared with fallen brothers who died for a truth that never needed translation. Outside his door, the world convulsed, each revelation another thunderclap crashing down on a nation that had slept too long. But he sat, spine straight, breath deep, unmoved, a living testament to the power of quiet conviction. As the last echo of his 12 words rippled outward, slicing through the pretense and the noise, the message seared itself into the collective mind. True restraint is not weakness. It is the final, unanswerable blade. The final shockwaves from the investigation still pulsed through every newsroom and neighborhood when the day of sentencing arrived. The nation gathered around glowing screens, breaths caught in collective suspension as the courtroom lights flickered to life on live television. The judge rose from his high-backed chair, robes heavy with the weight of a verdict long overdue, his eyes locked on the disgraced officer, who trembled behind a barricade of lawyers and broken pride, his face pale as paper, lips quivering like a man watching the gallows being built in real time. The judge's voice cut through the hush, sharp and resonant as a cathedral bell at midnight. This officer stands convicted of assault, abuse of power, and the defilement of a decorated warrior's honor. He is hereby stripped of all civil rights, permanently banned from any future service, and reduced to the bare bones of citizenship. The words cracked against the walls, echoing into the nation's living rooms like cannon fire. Each syllable peeled away another layer of the officer's fragile facade, exposing the raw, festering wound underneath. The camera zoomed in on the officer's face as he crumbled. His mouth collapsed into a gaping maw, eyes rolling back, snot and tears flooding down his cheeks in chaotic rivers. His screams shredded into the microphone, a symphony of betrayal and self-pity that fell dead on arrival. "I'm the victim. I'm the one they lied to. You don't understand. I'm the victim," he howled, voice rising into a shrill pitch that stabbed through the air, clawing at sympathy that would never come. Across from him, the SEAL stood still as an ancient monolith, shoulders squared, breath so steady it seemed to hum beneath his skin. His eyes locked on the officer, unblinking, his stare a silent execution more final than any blade. As the man's wails curdled into desperate gasps, the SEAL tilted his head, the movement glacial and measured, his jaw tightening like a coiled fist. His voice broke through the chaos, quiet but scorching enough to set the entire room aflame. "Victim?" he echoed, each consonant a hammer driving into the man's crumbling spine. "You chose that mask." A shockwave of silence slammed into the room, rolling across the entire country like a hurricane's eye. Then, as if on cue, the world exhaled. A tidal wave of applause detonated across city blocks and living rooms. People rose from couches and sidewalks alike, hands clapping in a frenzy that rattled windows and set the night sky ablaze with car horns and fireworks. The slogan "Honor over Violence" lit up every screen, a digital banner that unfurled over the entire nation, the phrase echoing into the marrow of every heart. The officer collapsed, his knees slamming into the courtroom floor with a dull, final thud. His forehead pressed into the wood as he sobbed, fingers clawing at the polished surface like a man trying to scratch his way out of a coffin. His entire body shook with the force of his own undoing, a grotesque puppet show of guilt and terror now laid bare for every citizen to dissect. In brutal contrast, the SEAL remained frozen, his face an impassive sculpture, eyes locked forward, unyielding. The glow from the overhead lights carved deep shadows across his features, turning every line into an inscription of unbreakable resolve. His shoulders didn't tremble, his jaw didn't loosen, he didn't even blink. Beside him, the fallen man seemed to dissolve into a blur of salt and spit, a living monument to every lie he had chosen to wear. Across the country, fireworks screamed into the night. In small towns and big cities alike, strangers embraced each other in the streets, their voices rising in a chorus of raw, unfiltered relief and admiration. Children clutched posters bearing the seal's likeness. Mothers wept into trembling hands. Fathers stood rigid with fists over their hearts. The phrase "honor over violence" painted itself on walls, flashed across digital billboards, and ricocheted through every news headline. Reporters scrambled to frame the moment, but every attempt fell flat beneath the seismic power of the SEAL's presence and the simple finality of his words. Commentators choked on adjectives, struggling to describe a man who had weaponized silence, who had made the entire country understand that power is not measured by the noise you make, but by the storms you can contain without flinching. As the camera pulled back, the final image broadcast to millions was stark and unforgettable. The officer crumpled, face buried against the cold, unyielding floor. The SEAL standing erect, eyes like obsidian, posture like a blade drawn under moonlight. In that moment, it wasn't just a courtroom. It was an altar where a nation laid down its illusions and rose anew under the banner of honor reclaimed. As the final echoes of the nationwide applause still trembled in the air, a new stage awaited the SEAL, a grand hall beneath the domed ceiling of the Capitol itself, where the nation's lawmakers and leaders gathered in rigid rows. The air was electric, each breath pulled taut between reverence and anticipation. He stepped forward, boots striking the polished floor with the same quiet gravity that had already toppled empires of ego. He stood at the center of the grand podium, a single spotlight cascading down, turning the air around him into a sacred glow. Eyes from every corner of the chamber locked onto him, breaths collectively suspended, as if the entire country had forgotten how to inhale. The cameras poised, lenses trembling, journalists frozen mid-scribble, all waiting for the words they thought would come. But the SEAL didn't open his mouth. His lips remained sealed, his eyes sweeping across the crowd with a calm that burned hotter than any speech. The silence roared louder than a stadium of thunderous chants. He tilted his head forward, a slow, deliberate bow that carried the weight of every fallen comrade, every oath whispered into the darkness before an ambush, every final heartbeat of brothers left in foreign sands. The movement was not a performance, but a sacred ritual, a testament to the unyielding creed carved into his bones. No applause dared interrupt. The world froze in the space between heartbeats. A giant screen flickered to life behind him, bathing the hall in an otherworldly glow. A simple letter appeared, each word typed in stark black against a white void. Honor needs no sound, only a heart that listens. The sentence hung there, suspended in the air like the final note of a hymn echoing through a cathedral. Each letter felt heavy, impossibly so, as if they carried the marrow of every sacrifice ever made in silence. A tremor rippled through the audience. One by one, the lawmakers rose, hands drifting to their chests, palms flattening over racing heartbeats. Eyes glossed over, tears slipping down faces usually carved in stone by politics and power plays. Their breaths hitched, caught in the gravity of a man who needed no slogans, no fiery crescendos. They felt it, each syllable stabbing into the ribs, anchoring itself into the softest parts of them they hadn't touched in decades. The SEAL remained still, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the hard lines of his face, casting deep shadows that made him look carved from iron and moonlight. His fingers twitched once at his side, a movement so subtle it almost vanished, but it was there, a silent punctuation, an invisible signature. Then, as if bound by some ancient code, he turned and began his walk off the stage. Each step echoed through the hall, a metronome counting the seconds of a moment destined to be carved into the nation's collective soul. He did not raise a hand to wave. He did not slow to acknowledge the sea of tear-streaked faces rising in ovation. He did not pause to absorb the roaring silence that crashed like waves against the chamber walls. He simply moved forward, shoulders set, spine straight as a drawn blade, eyes locked ahead on some horizon only he could see. As he vanished beyond the curtains, a single spotlight remained, focused on the empty chair he had left behind. The light pooled onto the seat, turning it into a glowing altar, a phantom presence that seemed to whisper in the hush that followed. Here sat a man who needed no words to wage the loudest war. Journalists tried to find words to capture it. Commentators choked on their scripts, their voices cracking against the immovable weight of that silent bow. Cameras zoomed in on trembling hands, on lips mouthing his final sentence like a prayer. In homes across the country, families stood from dinner tables, fingers pressed over hearts, televisions casting a holy glow across living rooms now transformed into shrines of quiet reverence. Outside the Capitol, the slogan "Honor over Violence" lit up digital billboards, projected across skyscrapers, burned into the night sky by drones carrying trails of light like comets. People in the streets stopped, some falling to their knees, others lifting candles high above their heads, a sea of flickering flames mirroring the eternal echo of one man's silent command. In that long, echoing moment, the SEAL's retreat did not feel like an exit. It felt like an arrival, a quiet coronation not of a king but of a living idea, an embodiment of restraint, of ferocity channeled inward rather than splashed outward in shallow performance. His figure may have left the stage, but his presence flooded every artery of the city, every whispered confession, every oath renewed in the dark corners of quiet rooms. As the last ripple of his steps dissolved into the shadows, the light on the empty chair seemed to grow brighter. A silent torch passed to every eye that dared meet its glow. And somewhere, in that layered quiet, a single heartbeat seemed to echo louder than any anthem, honor above all else. The echo of his silent exit still haunted the Capitol's marble halls when a flickering screen ignited in a cold, fluorescent prison cell miles away. The disgraced officer, stripped of his titles, sat slumped against the iron bars, eyes sunk deep into dark hollows, hands trembling as they clutched the thin fabric of his uniform, now a ghost of authority that offered no warmth. A guard stepped forward, his boots echoing down the sterile corridor, and slid a small tablet across the floor to rest at the officer's feet. The screen glowed an eerie pale blue, pulsing with a soft heartbeat that didn't belong to him anymore. On the screen, the SEAL's face appeared, framed in stark, clinical lighting that seemed to magnify every contour of his chiseled jaw, every scar that whispered entire lifetimes of pain and discipline. His eyes deep, obsidian pits, locked onto the camera with a calm, so absolute it felt like a tidal wave, held at bay by sheer will. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. The silence before he spoke pressed into the room like a weight, heavy enough to suffocate even the loudest thoughts. Then his voice, low and even, rolled out across the concrete walls, slicing through the stale air like a cold blade. "I don't hate you," he began, each word chosen with surgical precision, each syllable a hammer on the officer's skull. "I pity the shadow you chose to become." The sentence landed like an avalanche, collapsing the last fragile scaffolding the officer had built inside his own mind. The officer's pupils dilated, breath catching in his throat as he lunged at the screen, fingers clawing at the image, nails screeching across the glass in a frenzied blur. "No, shut up! You don't know me! You don't know what I've been through!" he shrieked, spit spraying onto the floor, eyes wild and bloodshot. He snatched the tablet off the ground, raising it above his head before hurling it against the far wall. The plastic casing exploded in a shower of shattered circuits and sparks, fragments clattering to the floor like shrapnel from a self-inflicted grenade. Breathing ragged, he staggered backward, knees buckling as his back slammed into the bars. His hands shot to his head, fingers digging into his scalp, clutching as though trying to rip out the guilt now festering in every neuron. He slid downward, collapsing into a crumpled heap on the concrete, sobs tearing from his throat like an animal caught in a steel trap. The hollow clang of his final breakdown reverberated across the cell, merging with the faint static still buzzing from the broken tablet pieces. Somewhere beyond those prison walls, the SEAL watched the final flicker of transmission fade from his monitor. He exhaled, a slow, measured breath that carried the weight of 1,000 battles fought inside and out. Without a word, he reached for his jacket, pulling it over his broad shoulders in a movement as fluid as a blade, sliding back into its sheath. His eyes, still dark and endless, held no triumph, no gloating glimmer, only a vast, echoing depth that swallowed every last justification the officer had ever whispered to himself in the dark. He stood, boots scraping lightly against the floor, and turned. His silhouette filled the doorway for a moment, a silent monument to choices, to consequences, to the difference between a man and the mask he wears. Then he stepped forward, disappearing into the dim hallway beyond, each step echoing like a war drum fading into the night. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, the screen now lay in pieces, shards glinting like tiny knives under the flickering overhead bulb. The officer's sobs rose and fell in guttural waves, echoing off the concrete like a choir of ghosts, chanting his every betrayal back at him. His fingers curled around his head tighter, his voice breaking into hoarse, animal howls that crawled up the walls and died in the corners of the cell. Outside, the world continued on in its loud, chaotic dance, unaware of the final private execution unfolding behind cold steel doors. But somewhere in the marrow of every watching soul, in every trembling breath taken by those who had followed the story, they felt it, the final severing, the irrevocable truth that no punishment could be harsher than being forced to face the hollow echo of your own cowardice. And in the silent retreat of the seal, in that refusal to stand witness to a man's final collapse, there was more condemnation than any gavel, more finality than any cell block. It was the last blow unseen, unheard, but felt deeper than any scar left by fist or bullet. The last echo of his final message still lingered like an electric pulse through the nation when he appeared once more, stepping into the sunlight as if emerging from the heart of a storm. Gone was the gray combat shirt, the tactical uniform that had once hugged his muscles like a second skin. Instead, he wore a crisp white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled neatly at the forearms, the fabric catching the light with an almost holy glow. His jeans were simple, worn but clean, each fold carrying the quiet strength of a man who didn't need armor to declare his resilience. A plain baseball cap shadowed his eyes, the bill angled down just enough to remind the world that true power never needs to show its full face. As he moved through the main street, the crowd parted like waves around a prow, each soul bowing their heads with a reverence so profound it stole the breath from every throat. Parents pressed hands over their children's hearts, veterans snapped crisp salutes before lowering their eyes, strangers clutched each other's arms as if to steady themselves against the gravity of his silent presence. In the outskirts of the city, the former officer shuffled through alleys littered with broken glass and rotting advertisements, his shoulders hunched so low he seemed to fold into himself. At a corner store, a teenage cashier hurled a stale sandwich at his feet, shouting that even rats had more honor. The sandwich splitting open in the gutter like a torn confession, mayonnaise splattering his scuffed shoes as he flinched, too beaten to protest. Farther downtown, a giant digital billboard once used to broadcast sports scores now looped an endless reel of his face twisted in courtroom shame, set to a mocking children's chant that looped through loudspeakers, the high-pitched voices echoing off the concrete like a nursery rhyme turned execution drum. In a park nearby, a group of skateboarders painted a mural over an old community wall, splashing red paint in jagged letters that spelled out "coward," each stroke slicing across his likeness with violent finality, while passers-by filmed and uploaded the process, hashtags multiplying like wildfire beneath a blood-orange sunset. Even at night, when he tried to hide in the abandoned subway tunnels, echoes of laughter and jeers trickled down from the vents above, strangers tossing scraps of paper scrawled with curses that drifted down to land around his feet like falling ash. Each scrap a silent verdict delivered from an invisible jury he could never confront. Meanwhile, under the noon blaze, the man in white kept walking, his pace unhurried, the soft roll of his shoulders matching the rhythm of a heartbeat only he could hear. Each step seemed to chisel his silhouette deeper into the earth, leaving a trail of intangible energy that shimmered in the heat waves above the asphalt. He didn't raise a hand to acknowledge the cameras or the sea of trembling eyes, nor did he flinch when a baby wailed from a mother's arms as though sensing an uncontainable force passing by. His gaze remained fixed forward, the brim of his cap slicing through the light, his jaw set with a stillness more commanding than any shout. A street musician paused mid-note, his bow hovering above violin strings, and a florist abandoned her bouquet stand, petals scattering like soft confetti across the sidewalk, the scent of jasmine and rose trailing in the wake of the man's silent authority. A stray dog lay down flat as he passed, ears pressed back in instinctual submission, eyes wide and reverent in a language older than words. On rooftops above, flags stilled against the wind, their cloths hanging limp as if even the breeze refused to intrude upon his passage. Pedestrians who had been arguing moments before fell into hushed embrace, their foreheads pressed together, tears slipping down cheeks as if the world had reset its moral axis beneath their feet. And through it all, the city itself seemed to pause, traffic lights frozen on green as if even machinery understood that this man moved beyond the commands of ordinary time. Midway down the street, a young boy stepped forward, trembling slightly, his small hand outstretched. He wore a white t-shirt emblazoned with 3 black words, "Honor over violence." His eyes, wide and wet with awe, tracked every motion of the man approaching. The seal slowed, gaze falling onto the boy with a softness that contrasted the carved marble of his jaw. A quiet smile ghosted across his lips, not wide, not showy, but sharp enough to split the sky above them. He extended his hand, meeting the boy's in a clasp firm but gentle, the boy's tiny fingers dwarfed by the scars and calluses of a warrior's palm. For a long moment, they stood locked together, time holding its breath around them. Blocks away, a giant LED screen in a crowded plaza displayed a continuous loop of the disgraced officer's face during his trial breakdown, his twisted expression frozen between anguish and denial, while crowds gathered below threw rotting fruit at the base of the screen, as if each splatter could cleanse a century's worth of silent complicity. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, teenagers on bicycles chased the officer as he tried to hide behind overgrown hedges, recording every stumble and shriek on their phones, the videos instantly uploaded with mocking captions, and set to dance remixes that turned his pleas into viral hooks echoing through every hallway and rooftop party, his name dissolving into a meme sharper than any blade. At an abandoned railway station, an artist spray-painted a towering mural of the seal's silhouette, his head slightly bowed, the words, "We remember the quiet ones," curling around the image like a protective shield, while nearby, the officer's face was defaced with crimson slashes that dripped down onto the cracked platform like symbolic blood, his fallen figure now just another cautionary stain on the city's forgotten corners. In a late-night diner where drunks and dreamers usually found refuge, a lone guitarist performed an improvised song weaving together the seal's last words and the viral footage of the officer's collapse. Each chord a steel needle threading through the gathered listeners, who leaned in close as if each note might reveal a secret map to a world no longer willing to cradle cowards in shadows. Back on the sunlit street, the seal's other hand hovered just above the boy's shoulder, his fingers curved slightly as though catching the pulse of a future not yet fully born. The air shimmered around them, heat rising from the pavement in soft waves that bent the distant cityscape into a dreamlike mirage. The boy's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his free hand curled into a trembling fist at his side, his eyes unable to tear away from the quiet ferocity standing before him. All around, camera lenses extended and retracted in rhythmic sync, capturing angles they hoped would become tomorrow's gospel. Each shutter click a frantic attempt to bottle the impossible weight of a man whose silence roared louder than any speech. Further down the block, shopkeepers abandoned registers mid-transaction to watch, their palms pressed against windows fogged with their startled exhalations, while delivery drivers left parcels on doorsteps without signatures, drawn helplessly forward as if by an invisible magnetic pull. In a nearby rooftop garden, an elderly woman dropped her watering can among the lavender stems, hands clasped over her mouth, eyes streaming with a grief she hadn't known she carried, her knees bending slowly until she knelt among the purple blooms, the water soaking into the soil around her like an unspoken prayer. A stray breeze carried faint echoes of the chants from the plaza. Fragments of taunts turned anthems swirling past the boy's ears, tickling the fine hairs on his neck, embedding themselves into the edges of his growing heartbeat. The seal's arms stiffened as he adjusted his stance, his elbow forming a line so precise it could have been drawn by a blade across parchment, each tendon beneath his skin flexing in perfect orchestration. A hush rolled over the entire boulevard, a long inhalation that seemed to stretch the seconds into entire lifetimes, as though every bystander were holding the same invisible thread, afraid to snap it with a cough or whisper. Without breaking eye contact, the SEAL bent forward, a single vertebra at a time, his spine an unyielding column of quiet revolt against a world that once screamed for violence but now knelt for dignity. In that bow, the entire nation saw a torch passed not to a government or an institution, but into the small, steady hands of a generation still learning how to breathe. Flashbulbs exploded around them, media scrambling to capture an image that would echo through centuries. Headlines splashed across every screen and banner, "The man who turned silence into thunder." People wept openly, their hands trembling as they clutched phones, some unable to raise them high enough to record, afraid to break the sanctity of the moment. Meanwhile, somewhere in the city's shadows, the former officer drifted through alleyways like a ghost, his clothes tattered, his hair matted with grime. No name followed him now, no badge weighed down his chest. Faces turned away as he approached, children hid behind parents, and even stray dogs slinked into dark corners. Outside a shuttered convenience store, a group of teenagers filmed a mock trial using a cardboard cutout of his face, pelting it with eggs and cheap beer, their laughter rising into a feverish chant that spread like wildfire online, each broken yolk on the ground shimmering under streetlights like tiny pools of radioactive guilt. Near the old bus terminal, a mural once dedicated to community heroes was abruptly covered with black spray paint, his name scrawled in jagged letters alongside crude symbols, and as the paint dripped down in thick black veins, a small crowd gathered to hurl insults and record short gleeful videos, the hashtag number Ghost of Coward climbing to the top of every trending chart before dawn. At a midnight food truck rally, a local poet took the stage with a battered megaphone, weaving his downfall into a spoken word performance that turned the officer's trembling courtroom pleas into rhythmic stabs of verse, each line amplified by speakers that cracked and moaned under the strain, the audience erupting into a mixture of cheers and sobs as fragments of his disgrace cut through the smoke and neon haze like glass. In a coastal suburb, homeowners lined their sidewalks with flickering candles and handwritten signs, but instead of prayers or tributes, each sign bore curses scorched into cardboard with heated iron rods, the phrases, reading like final verdicts delivered under moonlight. Drivers passing by slowed to roll down windows, spitting or throwing empty cans into the front yards, each metallic clatter echoing across the quiet waves, as if the ocean itself recoiled from his memory. Back in the city's labyrinthine underbelly, he shuffled forward, feet scraping against broken asphalt, the shreds of his once crisp uniform dragging behind him like tattered flags surrendering to the wind. Each step seemed to drain what little remained of his spine, his shoulders collapsing inward until his chest caved in like a failed fortress. Shopkeepers glanced up from their counting tables only to slam shutters with a violence that rattled every coin in the register, their silhouettes disappearing behind metal slats as quickly as they had emerged, leaving him staring at his own reflection in the streaked glass, a grotesque echo of power that no longer belonged to him. In an abandoned metro station, a projector flickered against the tiled walls, looping the moment he collapsed to his knees in court, his screams now set to an eerie, stretched-out soundtrack that transformed his cries into ghostly wails, a performance piece by an anonymous artist that drew a circle of young onlookers, each capturing pieces on their phones to share as digital relics of his unraveling. Further above, under the sharp blade of a crescent moon, rooftop gardens hosted late-night gatherings where strangers traded hushed stories of betrayal and cowardice, each anecdote punctuated by glasses raised in mock toasts to a man whose spine had liquefied under the simplest demand for honor. Among them, a girl painted black X's over his face in an old police department yearbook, her brush strokes quick and almost tender, as though erasing a ghost that refused to die. Beyond the steel and glass, under the final glow of a flickering street lamp, he paused, hands shaking, breath catching in ragged, uneven waves, the shadows around him tightening like a noose spun from every silent judgment he had once dismissed. The rain began to fall in thin, sharp threads that cut across his skin without mercy, each drop a tiny blade that washed grime into rivers along the cracked sidewalk, leaving streaks of red-brown tears on his cheeks as he staggered onward, searching for any doorway that might grant him a moment of shelter he no longer deserved. But each door stayed shut, each window blank-eyed, each streetlight flickering as if winking out of pity or disgust, his reflection shattered into 1,000 fragments on every wet surface he passed, a kaleidoscope of regret and ruin twisting with every trembling step. He had become the living embodiment of a rotting echo, a warning that cowardice corrodes deeper than any bullet wound. Back on the sunlit street, the SEAL finally released the boy's hand, turning to continue his walk. Each step carried the quiet thunder of an entire creed, the invisible banner of honor over violence woven into the very air that shivered around him. No entourage followed, no reporters clamored at his heels. His strength radiated outward, so intense it needed no words to sear itself into the skin of every witness. At the far edge of the crowd, a giant screen displayed a looping clip of the disgraced officer's courtroom breakdown, his face contorted into a grotesque mask of defeat, the audio remixed into a synthetic wail that reverberated through the plaza like a digital funeral dirge, drawing small groups who jeered and filmed reaction videos, their laughter sharp enough to splinter glass. In a nearby alley, graffiti artists layered over an old campaign mural with an enormous portrait of the SEAL's silhouette, the word "Ghost" spray-painted over the officer's faded features, in dripping red strokes that bled down the bricks and pooled onto the pavement like coagulated regret. Pedestrians stopping to photograph each new line as though documenting a sacred ritual. A block away, street performers reenacted the trial's most humiliating moments with exaggerated mimicry, their voices twisting the officer's once authoritative bark into squeals of childish panic, each gesture punctuated by thrown coins and mock salutes that shimmered under the afternoon light, their performance broadcast live by influencers, eager to catch every visceral twitch of public scorn. In a rooftop cafe overlooking the boulevard, diners leaned against the railing, recording the slow march below while chanting fragments of the SEAL's phrases, the rhythm bouncing from table to table, weaving through the potted plants and neon signs until it spilled down into the street like a chorus, carried on a sacred breeze, merging with the hush that trailed behind him. A woman nearby clutched her chest, tears carving clean paths down her cheeks. An elderly veteran removed his hat, holding it over his heart with trembling fingers. Children sat stunned, their eyes reflecting the shimmering outline of the man who walked past them without a backward glance. The SEAL never paused, never turned, his head held forward, the brim of his cap slicing the air like a blade through fog. When he reached the end of the block, he paused for a breath, chest rising and falling in that controlled, almost ritualistic cadence that had come to define him. He lifted his chin slightly, feeling the warmth of the sun wash over his face, a silent salute to the brothers and sisters who had never made it back to see this dawn. In that pause, the city stood suspended on the edge of its heartbeat, an entire population leaning forward as if to catch a final sacred whisper. Then he stepped forward again, his silhouette shrinking into the light until he seemed less a man than a moving monument, an idea set free to walk the earth on borrowed bones. Behind him, the crowd exhaled as one, their collective breath rising like incense, a prayer that needed no words, only the quiet understanding that they had witnessed something immortal. And in that last glimpse of his retreating form, the straight back, the clenched fist held just loose enough to fight again if needed, the humble bow that had set a nation ablaze, he became more than a hero. He became a symbol so deeply carved into the marrow of the people that no storm, no enemy, no lie would ever erase it. He had become a silence turned to lightning, and in every trembling chest that watched him disappear, his echo would live forever.